Yeah, Warhammer 40,000. I think before I say anything about Warhammer 40,000, Warhammer 40k, let me just say it was a long time ago, and memory's a funny thing. So what I remember and what other people might remember could be slightly different. Usually they are. I often get people talking to me about things we did together and say, do you remember doing this? Do you remember doing that? And I don't. But they have utterly clear memory of doing something. So, a caveat to start with. It was a while ago, and memory is a tricksy thing. Let's talk a little bit about before Warhammer 40,000, because before Warhammer 40,000, science fiction, wargaming, it did exist. There were numerous board games, particularly by companies like SPI. But in terms of wargaming, there was nothing massive, but it did exist. There was no doubt about that. Warhammer 40,000 didn't invent science fiction wargaming. And in the late 70s, myself and Richard Halliwell had already started wargaming science fiction figures using mostly the minifigs range. Minifigs produced a range of science fiction figures in the mid-70s, and they were fairly crude 25mm figures, but we invented our own rules, primarily because there weren't any other rules. So we started games design to provide our own rules for our own games, like both science fiction and fantasy. And eventually we published a set of rules, and they were called Combat 3000. Combat 3000 was I think it's a percentage-driven system, and we tried to provide rules for what were then common or easily available science fiction figures. So, we had a little bit of experience in that. And later, when we teamed up with Brian Ansell at Asgard to do various bits and pieces, we got access to some of the things that Asgard were making. At that time, Asgard were importing American figures, or were importing the rights, molds in some cases, to make figures from the McEwan range. Now, McEwan, they made a range based on a game called Stargard in America. You couldn't get this in the UK, and I managed to find this. That's the first supplement for Stargard, called Arilla. I don't think I ever had a copy of Stargard itself, but this was typical of the time, and the quality, it's typeset, it's fairly crudely illustrated, black and white, and the rules are, well, if anything, rather complex. I think that was a trend at the time. Another game, again, this precedes Warhammer 40,000, was by Mark Ratner. It's a Fantac game, and again, it's American. That was called Space Marine. That was later republished by GDW, Games Design Workshop, not to be confused with Games Workshop. Again, it's an American game. It feels very American, actually. It's very. It feels a lot like the war in the Pacific in space. Never played it, but I owned that copy. Later on, Brian Ansell would produce a game called Laserburn, which people are often more familiar with. Now, Laserburn was published by Tabletop Games in Nottingham, and Brian Ansell also made a range of figures for this game, and the figures were largely inspired by those things I've just shown you, or by traditional science fiction. So they included mostly armoured warriors, mostly human. Brian didn't particularly like or think there was any commercial value in doing aliens. And he was inspired by, there's a comic book series he was inspired by. I don't remember the name of it offhand, but it was very much a kind of Renaissance costume in space kind of aesthetic. And Brian was inspired by that to produce figures that had these sort of ruffled sleeves and slashes and things like that. And they were included in the Laserburn range. And I think that was an aesthetic he enjoyed. Later on, he would go on to make figures in the Spacefarers range for Citadel that were very similar. And there was a game produced called Spacefarers. That was actually done, I think, by the guys in London. I don't recall offhand, but this was produced by Games Workshop. Not very good, to be honest. I think it was role players trying to write a war game. But the Spacefarers range was a little bit more influential, and I would use some of the figures from that range in my own war games. So the ancestry of 40k is rooted in these things. Later on, Richard Halliwell and Brian Ansell produced this. It's a game called Imperial Commander. And this uses some of the tabletop games, in fact, tabletop games production. Imperial Commander was a large-scale war game using for 15mm figures. Again, figures all designed by Brian. And some of those have a sort of proto-Space Marine kind of feel to them. Although I didn't write that game, I was involved in all the playtesting with Hal, and I had some fairly substantial armies for it, in fact. So those are some of the things that we were already playing in the 70s, and then which we became familiar with in the early 80s. Now, Rogue Trader, the very first edition of Warhammer 40,000, was a game that has its origins in a science fiction ship game that I created before I worked for Games Workshop. It was one of the things that it was a personal project that I was doing. I was making the science fiction ships, and I was writing the game. And the game was based on the idea that you were role-playing a spaceship captain or the owner of a spaceship fleet, depending on how advanced you were. And the ships were fairly basic types, freighters, fighters, larger ships, capital ships. And your role was essentially a trader, hence the name Rogue Trader. But you would be obliged to face pirates and sometimes local authorities and each other. And the games themselves were enacted as little spaceship combat games, so you could play it simply as a spaceship versus spaceship game without any of the role-playing elements. But it was envisaged as a role-playing game, and you had progress in the usual sense. So your ships or your ship captains could become more experienced, gain special abilities, and along the way you could explore possibly alien or abandoned sort of fortresses or planets and acquire technologies. And all these things have parallels with magic items and treasure and so on and so forth. So to some extent it's following the model of D&D and traditional role-playing. And that was Rogue Trader. But when I joined Games Workshop, I'd been working on this game for a while, and Brian Ansell was running Games Workshop. He was running Citadel Miniatures as part of Games Workshop at the time. He was keen on getting me on board. And one of the things that I kind of agreed with him before I started working was that we would produce Rogue Trader as a Games Workshop Citadel product. And at that time, he bought the spaceship range off me at the time. And that remained the case for a little while. In fact, there was an advert that appeared in one of the compendiums for that game. And it's got an illustration by Tony Ackland, and it's got a little bit of not so much a write-up, but a little bit of I think you'd say fluff these days, a little bit of promotional write-up for it. Although the name Rogue Trader was used subsequently for Warhammer 40k, the original game was never produced. The ships that were part of that game ended up in the Spaceship Code, and some of them remained on sale for quite a while. But on the whole, the 40k game had little to do with that Rogue Trader. I'd kind of already come up with the idea of the races being based on fantasy races. So the Eldar were part of that. The Orcs were part of that. But quite how those Eldar or Orcs would be manifest within the game, bearing in mind it was a spaceship game, I hadn't really thought deeper. But I'd considered that we'd have Orcs, which were barbaric and brutal, and we'd have Eldar, which were the more ethereal, technologically advanced race. The parallels are fairly obvious. Meanwhile, I joined Games Workshop, Citadel Ventures, and we published the first Warhammer fantasy game to be very popular. One of the things that we started doing straight away, and say we, I mean primarily Richard Halliwell and myself, was to incorporate science fiction elements into the fantasy games, because the rule set was a very broad rule set, and the original Warhammer was a little bit more of a role-playing style game, or a skirmish war game really, where individuals could be moved individually. It wasn't a unit-based game initially, although you could fight in units. And this is one of the first compendiums. Now, the cover, which is by John Blanche, has one of the Amazons on it, and she's firing what is actually a laser pistol at a Viking adventurer. That's it, and that's exactly the sort of thing that we had. We incorporated these science fiction elements in as fantastical elements or fantasy elements, and we came up with the Slan, the old Slan, as a technologically advanced science fiction race that were the creators of the Warhammer fantasy world. I mean, that sort of idea, it's inspired by things like Philip Jose Farmer's World of Tears series, and some science fiction of the time, whereby a fantasy environment has science fiction elements. I think the Anne McCaffrey World of Pern with the dragons in it, it has those kind of elements in it, where the world is a fantastical world, but has science fiction elements. I think the John Norman books, the Gore series, have a similar thing, although not much read these days. But all of that lay behind the inspiration for a lot of these ideas. So, having provided rules for some of these things in a Warhammer context, there was a sort of a taste for a science fiction game in the Warhammer style. And that's really what the very first Rogue Trader, Warhammer 40,000, was. And it's this book I'm talking about. This is my somewhat battered copy that I used at Games Workshop as my markup copy or master copy for many years. It's got the Warhammer 40,000 title on it. It also has the Rogue Trader title on. The reason we did that was because, having advertised Rogue Trader in its original form, we were constantly bombarded with people asking when it was going to come out. It became a joke. When's Rogue Trader going to come out? Was a question I'd get at every Games Day and every Golden Demon or event that we had. So in the end, we felt we had to put Rogue Trader on the cover, just to kind of stop people asking about it, really. So Warhammer 40,000 was the title we chose. We decided we couldn't call it Rogue Trader, not because it wasn't the original game, but because we already were producing a game under license called Rogue Trooper, which is based on the 2000 AD license. But it was too confusing, having a game called Rogue Trooper and a game called Rogue Trader. So we couldn't call it Rogue Trader, so that became almost like a subtitle, if you like. And that's the reason for that. The original game probably, it's fair to say, bears almost no relationship to the modern game as I understand it, and as it became whilst I was working at Games Workshop. The original game is a narrative skirmish war game with role-playing elements. To some extent, it's a role-playing game. And that was true of the early Warhammers as well. It's a game that requires a games master, or at least suggests you use one and plays best in that context. It's not a head-to-head tabletop war game between equal or even forces. That concept has become totally dominant amongst tabletop wargaming, but that wasn't the case back then. Back then, a games master or an umpire would create a scenario, invent a tabletop situation. The players would not necessarily have full details of what was going on. They'd be given their briefing from the umpire, and then they would try to achieve their objectives within that briefing. They might not know what the other guy's briefing was. They might not even know who the other guy is in terms of an opponent. You know, they might be going in to investigate a mysterious situation where an outpost has disappeared, stopped broadcasting, has been abandoned. They don't know why. They're going in to find out, and that's all they know. And when they turn up, it could be gene stealers, it could be some sort of strange alien that's taken over, it could be rebel space marines, it could be anything. Like anything could have happened. How the scenario played out would then be determined by the umpire, and he might introduce third player elements in the form of umpire controlled pieces. Both sides might not necessarily know that. They could think that the umpire controlled pieces are being controlled by the other player in some situations. You know, it's quite anarchic. How the players then have done at the end of the game would be up to the umpire to say, well, you scored so many points for this, you didn't know you were doing that, but you have, and the other player similarly, and then both players would be assessed at who's done the best. That's nothing like a tabletop war game. There's no points, there's no sense of it being balanced, there's not even a sense of a consistent objective. The objective could change depending on the circumstance. You know, if you're going in to investigate what happens if somewhere's being abandoned, then if you find out it's been taken over by Ghibli aliens, you found out, what are you then going to do about it? And that was the original Rogue Trader game. Some of the elements of it stem from models we were already making. The reason for that is because when I was given the go-ahead to do Warhammer 40,000, one of the briefs from Brian was that it had to include rules for all the models we currently could fit into it, like monsters, and in some cases models in the science fiction range that we produced for 2000 AD. We were currently making models for the Judge Dredd role-playing game, the Judge Dredd license. We were also doing Doctor Who, actually, I think at the time for the BBC. So I was sort of obliged to use some of that stuff. The other thing was we'd no intention originally of making many models for it. Brian always believed that science fiction didn't sell particularly well, and that was based on all those things I've just shown you, including his own laser burn range. It was his conviction that science fiction does not sell. That was a mantra. He also believed that people did not buy aliens. And again, that was based on his experiences in Asgard miniatures, where he made a lot of these things. He made aliens as well as humanoid creatures. So we weren't going to make very many models specifically for the game. And the intention was that people would take fantasy models and convert them. And we would produce conversion packs, basically weapons, backpacks, it may be the odd vehicle thing, but generally speaking, weapons. And we weren't going to produce crude weapons because crude weapons were too difficult to do. They were all weapons that people held. So you could take a fancy figure, put the weapon on it, and you've got your piece. That was the original intention. Now, that intention didn't last very long once the game was played. But when I was inventing it, that was part of the brief. So the reason why 40K had and has to this day orcs, Eldar elves, dwarves, space elves, space dwarves, which I called squats, and if halflings, which are called ratlings, and ogres. The reason why the races in 40k parallel all the races in the fantasy universe was simply because I couldn't have alien races. I had to make use of what we already had and provide weapons that could be handheld. That's why all of the weapons in the original 40k, first book, are basically shoulder mounted. Later on, and very quickly, we would do things that were little weapon combinations and bikes and all sorts of things, as well as bespoke miniatures, including Space Marines, of course. But initially, that wasn't the case, and I had a very limited palette to work with. And that determined, to a large extent, what I did with the background and with the miniatures. So I created a background around that idea of anywhere, any place, where you could have worlds scattered throughout the galaxy, which could be mysterious, basically adventure scenario places. The Space Marine chapters are scattered throughout the whole universe, so that wherever something's happening, you can always have a Space Marine chapter. And the backstory to the universe was deliberately designed as a sandpit. Mysterious Emperor is this figure who essentially just works as a beacon. Whether he's alive or whether he's dead is moot. I always imagined that the Emperor existed in this kind of dream state where he sometimes relates to reality and sometimes doesn't. But then you've got a whole religion that's grown up around the Emperor, and it's important to remember, well, I say it's not important at all to remember, but I always consider it important to remember in terms of the background that the growth of the religion, or the religious elements, because there are more than one, religious elements within the 40k universe, were a response to the Emperor. They were not something the Emperor set up or would have approved of or believed in. They're something that grew. The superstitions around the Emperor, the stories about the Emperor were simply added later and accreted over 10,000 years. And I created a game which had a long backstory to allow for those kind of elements. As it happened, that provided the bedrock for other things later on. But it's curious to imagine that it was all envisaged from the start, because it wasn't. It was largely dictated by commercial reasons and opportunities for gaming. I wanted to create a game where the opportunities for gaming were as great as in a whole imagined universe, not that were confined to a tabletop, and not that was confined to a tabletop where equal forces of one side lined up here and equal forces from another lined up here, and they went like that. But that absolutely was not in my mind. Obviously, as time progressed, things changed. By the time we came to do the second edition of Warhammer 40,000, that game had settled into something very different. I've got here a copy of the very first supplement we did for Rogue Trader. It's called Chapter Approved, which is one of the little stamps that Charlie Elliott, Chaz Elliott, the designer behind the visual aspect of this game. Charlie Elliott actually designed the internals. So the great look of this game is really down to him. And he came up with that Chapter Approved idea, and we just took the title. That book contains army lists, as well as a background scenario, which the scenario I'd already written. It was supposed to go into the original book, but we didn't have room. The Omni lists were an attempt to make the game play to a standard wargaming format. And it was something that I think Brian was very keen on, because I think he saw that as a way of selling more toy soldiers once the game had become established. And that was followed by various supplements which really did more to turn the game into a conventional war game. By the time we came to doing the second edition of Warhammer 40k, the original game was a bit of a mess because there were numerous supplements, all of which had slightly different rules variants in. And to play the game, you actually needed to buy the original book, ignore most of it, replace this bit with the supplement from one set of one book, add another book. It was just a complete dog's breakfast, really. And we needed badly to bring it all together and to reaffirm that it was essentially a tabletop war game, and that was the second edition. I must have written the second edition. I wrote the second edition. And that was in 1992, if I remember right. So Brian had left. The company had been bought out by Tom Kirby's. It was a management buyout, but Tom Kirby was the man behind that. So the company had changed ownership. Tom had become managing director, but had acquired in the process a debt of some millions of pounds at the time. It's in excess of £10 million, which we had to pay back. Tom had to pay back, really, but we had to pay back to the venture capitalists who had lent it to him. That meant that the company was suddenly very different. Now we had to build sales and profitability to service what was a large debt. I mean, the company wasn't turning over much more than about, let's say, £15 million at the time. And we had to service a debt of approximately £1 million a year. So we had to build the company quickly. We had to outgrow that debt. And part of that was in the product line. So we had to rationalise the product line and make it more appealable. We had to grow the retail business. In other words, we had to play to our strengths. I don't think we knew what our strengths were 100% at that time. So we were still doing board games, and we were still doing, we might have even been doing a little bit of role-playing games. We soon stopped doing those because there really wasn't the money in it. And one of the things that we decided to do right from the start were the big box games. Probably people are all very familiar with this. You've got a great big box, and it's got a basic starter army for one side and another side, and the basic rules in it. And that format was something that we had created with the Space Marine game, the Epic game, in 1991, I think. And I took that format and applied it to Warhammer in 1992, and then to the second edition of Warhammer 40k in 1993, I think. Yeah, 1993. One after the other. And that was a very successful format. It enabled us to build the community, the player base, very quickly. It was a very appealing thing. The value was very good. We spent quite a lot of money on the tooling for the plastics, but we knew it would pay back. It was one of the things that Tom understood and supported. It was one of the things that I pushed very hard on, the whole plastic line. I, probably not alone, but I could see that Games Workshop was moving in a direction where we would become a plastic-based company, not a lead metal-based company. At the time, that was perhaps a little bit more important than you might realise, because there was a lot of talk about banning the sale of lead-based toy soldiers. And all of our figures were lead-based at that time. Changing to a tin alloy was something that was considered was a big deal. So push on plastics, big box sets, plastic support, that was all part of the second edition ambition, is perhaps the word for it. That was what we were going for with the second edition. I took the opportunity to do a lot of work on the background to perhaps set it in stone in a way in which it hadn't been before, to be quite flexible. During the first edition, we'd done a few things that had been rather off-piste. That's not unlikely, because when you think about it, it was a sandpit. You could do anything in this world. And we'd done a few things which were not quite central to the core of 40k, including gene stealer cults, for example. We'd also introduced Tyranids in a slightly different way. I decided to keep the Tyranid element, but we lost the gene stealers. We lost the gene stealer cults. So second edition became a more formal version of the game. The rules were tidied up, but not essentially changed in the way they were. They were still D6 based. Still used that core Warhammer type system. We then started doing the army books as a way of both fleshing out the background and providing the core army lists and rules for each army. And that format, again, I say that was part of the ambition for that whole second edition. And that worked very well up to a point. And what happened was the company expanded as we'd planned. We gained a French, German, Italian, Spanish business very quickly. That was one of Tom's plans, build the business by creating games workshops in Europe, and we already had a games workshop in America. The problem with the games workshops in Europe was they all wanted exactly the same product as we had in the UK. The English language product, which we sold in America and we sold in Canada and we sold in Australia, and which, to be honest, sold reasonably well in Europe for a foreign language game. But to build those businesses properly, they needed whatever their local language version of every game. That was not a consideration when I created Warhammer 40,000 or Warhammer. It wasn't a consideration initially when I did the second editions, because by then we already had a clear idea when Brian left, 1991 I think, where we were heading. We had ambitions of our own. We knew where we wanted to go with Warhammer 40k. So those big box sets and the little plastics and so on, they were already in the air. What wasn't in the air was making everything in French and German and Spanish, so on and so forth. By the time we came to do third edition, that was a consideration. There were lots of things in the second edition that were very, very difficult to do in multiple languages, mostly the card system for the psychics, for example, which I think mirrored the Warhammer fantasy version, and we had the same problem with fantasy. So all of a sudden we had to do games that not only worked in English, but which worked in different languages. And I say worked, I don't mean worked in terms of the language per se, I mean in terms of production runs, because we built the production runs for Warhammer so that we could get economies of scale. And those are really important at the time. They were really important when you're printing in card and you're making components, because your card print runs have to be higher to justify the price. You can print in low volumes, but printing in low volumes was horrendously expensive. So when it came to doing the big box games, which had we called it an SRA1, which is a big sheet of card paper, thick card, something like 1 millimetre up to 2 millimetres for boards. If you had to do a specific language on card, it just made the games completely unviable. to the extent that when we were printing supplements in Italian, I think it was the psychic supplement in Italian, we were losing money on every one we were selling. And when we did third edition, we got the opportunity to revise all that. So it was a commercial consideration, really, in terms of the language. It wasn't a game consideration. So I've said before that when you do German translations, the text is always longer. So a card that we'd done in English, where words fitted perfectly, often you couldn't get the words in German on the card. So third edition changed all that. The other thing with third edition was we'd built the business, and the retail organisation had massively expanded, and the way that retail operated had become different. I think it's true to say that in the 80s, the Games Workshop stores were run by people who loved games in a very general sense. When we sold mahjong sets, and we sold puzzles, and we sold computer games, alongside role-playing games and board games and all sorts of things. The Citadel miniatures and war games element, the Warhammer and the 40k, were only part of that. And a lot of the staff weren't particularly interested in those things, but they were interested in games in a very general sense. And that changed when Brian took over the company in the later 80s, but it was still an element of that when Tom took over in the 1990s. But very quickly, the stores became dedicated to selling and promoting Warhammer and Warhammer 40k, and to some extent the other games that we were producing at that time, but really the focus was on those two games. And the staff had to be very enthusiastic and very trained to sell those games. So we had a lot of younger staff who were only really interested in those games, and they were selling them to increasingly younger customers. When we shifted to a tin-based metal, which we must have done about the same time, the issue of sales to younger customers stopped being a problem. Before then, a Citadel miniature could not be sold to someone younger than 14 years, which is the definition of a toy in international toy sales terms. So every time a 13-year-old or a 12-year-old came into the store and tried to buy metal, it was an issue for our staff. And it became an issue for some local trading or standards who would come into our store and literally watch what was being sold. And that wasn't nice. Meanwhile, the state of New York was talking about banning lead toy soldiers totally. There were issues to deal with. And one of those issues, one of those solutions was to, as well as making more plastics, was to move to a tin-based metal pewter. That's not as easy as just changing the metal pot and changing the metal. When you make a mould, you have to cut it for lead or for tin, because they flow in different ways. So you can't just pull pewter into I'd say lead, white metal. It's a mixture of lead and tin, but mostly lead. You can't just switch them. So we have to remake all of the mould. So that's a big deal, particularly as we had two factories, a factory in America and a factory in the UK. And I believe the American factory switched first, so they pioneered the process. And we switched to pewter. Pewter is very different from white metal. It's harder, and it's a swine to work with if you're converting. And I hate it with passion. But it was what had to be done. Third edition would encompass all of those changes. So there were all these commercial considerations that had to be made. The main one for me came from retail. And the retail push was, we want to sell armies of toy soldiers and play bigger games, because the second edition, first edition was essentially still a skirmish war game. You could play with 30 figures aside, 40, maybe even more, a few vehicles, and people were playing bigger games, but the bigger games were taking forever because the game system was structured for a skirmish war game and worked very well for that. We used the same system essentially for Necromunda, which was a game-based game, and it worked very well. We slightly downscaled it for Necromunda, where we introduced more specific elements to do with wounds and so on and so forth. But we'd taken the core Warhammer 40,000 system as far as it could in terms of expanding it to make the game playable with more figures. Retail wanted us to do a game that supported more figures on the table. It was as simple as that. As it happens, myself and the head of retail, John Stallard, and we're good friends to this day, we always have been, we had been playing World War II games using 15mm figures from Skytrax. It's part of their Command Decision range, which is still available to this day. And they're very nice figures, albeit in traditional metal. But we'd been collecting figures. John had got largely German forces, and I'd got British. 1944-45, and we'd been playing games basically set in that period of the war. And I'd been making up rules. And John had been inputting into those rules because he's a very expert in that period of history and the technology and the various forces. So we cobbled together a set of wargame rules, which we played. And when it came to writing 40k, John said, we just want to play, speaking as the head of retail, we want to play bigger games, like the games we've been playing with World War II. And I thought, well, why don't we use our World War II rules, John? So I took the World War II rules that I'd written, and I basically stacked it up, Space Marines and Eldar and Orcs and vehicles for those World War II rules. And then I had to evolve them a little bit. So, you couldn't simply have Space Marines going around with the same stats as British Commandos or German Stormtroopers or whatever. You had to make them more appropriate for the fantastical environment and the super advanced weapons, which we did. And it worked very well. I demoed the game to John and to Tom Kirby, he's CEO. We played here. We played in my house upstairs in my upstairs war games room. We're currently in my downstairs war games room. And we played a game, and it just worked. It was just elegant and smooth, which was probably the result of me and John playing this World War II version of the game for a couple of years. And John and I are both similar in terms of what we want out of a war game. I think it fitted with what they were expecting in retail, something that could be... they used the terms fast, furious and fun, which was it was their mantra at the time. That was what they wanted, and it was that. I like a game to be... I can see being fast. I like a game to be well-paced. Furious, meh. I don't know what that means. I like a game that actually has moments of excitement and moments of tension. I suppose that's what I mean. And fun, well, I like a game to be challenging so that you've got the sense that you've done something that's rewarding. But if that's fast, furious and fun, that's fine. That's what they wanted. And I think with those caveats, the game that I outlined was fast, furious and fun. Now, all I did was a core games design. I then handed it over to Andy Chambers, who was already set up to do the third edition. I think my original draft horrified him completely, but he played it and he got his head around it. And to be fair, he then took it and developed it. I think I wrote the background. As I remember, I wrote the background. I might have done some of it and the other guys contributed bits. I don't really recall. By the time we did 3rd edition, I wasn't really working as games designer. I still did some games design work, but mostly it was either to cover things that other people were either unable to do or which had fallen off the radar for some reason. Or I did things that were peripheral, which were personal vanity projects. And War Master was that to some extent. Even the original version of Lord of the Rings was that to some extent, although I did it because no one else was available. But by the time we did Warhammer 3rd edition, I'd really stepped away from games design because I was managing the whole studio and I was basically product director. I was looking after all product design, print, legal team, and all that. So I didn't really have time. I spent most of my time communicating messaging up to the executive, of which I was a part, just trying to keep the studio in line with what the executive and the other parts of the company were expecting and needed. So it's manufacturing, and primarily manufacturing and sales. So I didn't have a lot of time for games design. I certainly couldn't focus entirely on it. And when you're doing a project like an entire relaunch of an edition, you need to focus on it. You don't do anything else for at least 10 weeks. That's where your head is. So I gradually stepped away, and other people had stepped up. I think Thomas Pyrin had stepped up to Warhammer. He'd become the main Warhammer writer, and the main 140k writer had become Andy Chambers, who was very capable and very much willing to undertake that role. He'd not frightened at all of it. He had his own vision of what 40k was, and that was fine. And to me, the important thing was that people did have a vision and that it was consistent with what the company wanted and the people who were playing the game, the customers, expected, and which I felt they would find exciting and appealing. That was all good. So I stepped away from it. So I can't really say an awful lot more about 3rd edition than that. That's how it originated. It was polished and refined, developed, and then I think we must have redone all the omnibooks because the old ones wouldn't have been compatible, which is a shame because they were very good in terms of their background and detail. I seem to remember this was the time when we were doing shorter codexes and omnibooks. That was another consideration from retail. I might have got that mixed up with the next edition, but I don't think so. I think the pressure came to do shorter books about that time. And again, that was from retail, and they just wanted something that was cheaper. Not something I was entirely happy with, but we made the best of it that we could. And you know, sometimes the commercial needs of the business have to override what would be a creative's ideal for the business or for the player base. And that's not a problem. Sometimes that's the way it goes. I think there were other times when we were given an opportunity as creative team to do something we really wanted, and the retail were a bit, I don't know, but we'll trust you. There was that element of trust. And sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. Those opportunities became less and less as the business progressed. And we had to focus more on the commercial needs, because when we didn't, the going wrong element of it suddenly became that didn't work. It didn't work, never mind, we'll try again. It became, oh my God, we've got vast overstocks, what a terrible thing. And we had to rein ourselves in. Again, not a problem. None of us ever had any issues with that. And I think that's something that people talk about sometimes. They talk about how the commercial aspects of it were a problem for the creative people. The creative people, I've heard the word, sorry, I've gone off on one here a little bit. I've heard the word used, creatives whining about not being able to do stuff. That was never the case. We always loved doing what we did, and the commercial restrictions were merely the environment within which we worked. If you didn't do that, The business didn't work. We didn't get paid at the end of the month. And we all knew that. And we all loved doing what we were doing. I say that, I go off on one. But third edition was very strongly directed by those commercial needs, and particularly by the sales needs. And it took 40k in a whole new direction in terms of gameplay, and I think it improved it in that context. I think the original game was a better game as Necromunda than it was as Warhammer 40,000, because it suited that style and that scale of game. It worked pretty well for the original game, but that did rely totally on an empire to turn it into something enjoyable and exciting. When you wanted to play a head-to-head, line-em-up war game, I think the third edition was a much better game. And I can only presume that the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th games, which built on that, were equally appropriate. The thing I can't say is what happened, because by the time we did the 4th, I wasn't running the studio personally. I handed it over. I was spending all of my time in the executive role. And although I was always available for the games designers to come and talk to as a mentor, some did and some didn't. And Andy Chambers largely didn't. I think Andy regarded Jervis as his mentor rather than me, because they had a close relationship and they were good friends. And that's fine. My door was always open, but as I say, Andy didn't really feel the need, and to be fair, didn't need to use me in that context. So my relationship to 40k ended largely with that. I trusted Andy. The people that were running the studio were happy with it. The retail guys and John, since sales director, showed no signs of being unhappy with it. Had they been unhappy, they would have talked to me about it. So 40k was off. It had a life of its own from that point. The only things that I think changed remarkably, I think the attitude to the background changed. And that was partly down to Andy, because he had a different vision of what the background was. Mine was always rather anarchic. It was that. I remember Andy once saying to me, "I don't understand how the economy works in Warhammer 40,000. And I looked at him and said, "What makes you think it works?" It doesn't need to work. It probably doesn't. A lot of things, economies work on faith, just like religions. I mean, money isn't worth anything, guys. It's all imagined, it's all pretend. The whole system works on the basis of trust and the fact that nobody lets it fail. That's why systems, when they break, they bend and then they break. They never change. They always are destroyed. And so I stepped away from Warhammer 40,000. I probably stepped away before I stepped away from Warhammer itself. And the reason for that is because Thomas Pirinin left. He got offered a job in the computer games industry. And it was an opportunity of a lifetime. And he went, and I think he was reluctant to give up, but he went and he had a whole new career. So someone else had to step into that Warhammer role. And I was always a little bit more closely attached to the Warhammer universe and world in a way than I was to the 40k universe and world. And largely, the people that stepped up into that role, I'm trying to think who it was originally. It was probably Alessio Cavatori, and he became the chief Warhammer guy for a while. And Alessio and I always had a close relationship, so to some extent we would talk over ideas for rules and things like that. In fact, when Alessio took over the 40k role, which I think he did after Andy left, I remember him coming into my office and demonstrating some rules, particularly about line of sight and details with me, and talking them over. And really, that's what I was there for. You could talk. You can talk over things like, how do we work out this line of sight rule in this situation with other games designers? Because we've all thought about these things in such detail for so long. We know where all the pit traps are. We know what happens if you go for this decision rather than that decision. And we know we go, what's the marginal position? What happens in this situation? And we just talked over those things. So I remember doing that. But other than that, I'd stepped away from Warhammer 40,000. And I can't really comment about the development of the game. As I was saying, I think other people have slightly different ideas about the background. I think the background became a little less fluid and less whimsical. I was always my idea of how organisations work is very much based on whimsy, about ideas or attitudes becoming ingrained but having little basis in truth or fact. And that is how organisations work. And all the 40k institutions that I invented are almost like based on that premise, that they believe certain things and act in certain ways because those beliefs are important to them, and they can't behave in other ways because it would undermine their beliefs. But those beliefs have no foundation in reality or have grown or become accreted over the years. And that was always my attitude to how things are. That's life. But I don't think the other guys really quite, I'm not saying cottoned on, I don't think they enjoyed that concept so much. And the backgrounds became more fact-based, or this is what happened, or these are things that are true within the universe. And to me, it lost a little bit of its ironic qualities. I didn't personally enjoy that so much. But if players enjoyed this, if the guys writing it enjoyed writing it that way, and if that's how it was perceived, that's okay. That's just an evolution of the game and the evolution of the background. And as I say, I've stepped away from it. The game that's current, I know almost literally nothing about. So I have to say, you have to talk to someone else about that, where we are, about those things. You might find that Jervis Johnson, who left Games Workshop only, I think a year before this recorded, he would be much more familiar with how the game was developed and why it developed in certain ways. I can only speak as someone who's only seen some of the models and heard people talk. I've really not looked at it in any detail. The models to me look big. They're definitely upscaled everything, both for Warhammer and for Warhammer 40,000. And I personally fought against that for a long time, insofar as I could bring any influence to bear on the process. The reason being, the bigger a model is, the more expensive it is to make, and that's particularly true of metal figures. But also the more space is occupied on the tabletop, so your standard size tabletop, and let's face it, it's 6 foot by 4 foot these days. The bigger your figures are, the effectively less room you have to play the game. The bigger the bases are, the more space is occupied by a unit. Footprints are bigger, so you're suddenly playing a different kind of game. And the current game, and I caveat again, I speak only as someone who's just seen what I've seen on videos and people play. It seems to have acquired more board game and card game elements, and I suspect that's because the people who are designing those games nowadays come from those kind of backgrounds. It was really myself, Richard Halliwell and Brian Ansell, the original Warhammer designers, and John Stallard for that matter, the man behind the retail in Games Workshop. We all came from a traditional wargaming background that was based upon either head-to-head wargaming, or often had a large narrative element, as games often did when they were played by people like Charles Grant, Brigadier Peter Young, and that crew back in the 60s. So that's all I can say, really. So I hope that's not been too rambling. I'm sure that other people can add much, and if there's anything that I got wrong or misremembered, I'm sure people will make a point of saying so in the comments below. Thanks very much.